Charles Leclerc and George Russell. Charles Leclerc got praised for this overtake into the chicane, out of not into turn 11, I think it is. It was out of turn 12, and of course Charles Leclerc. I was very upset about it at the time that they said they were not going to review this in the race. They were going to review it after the race ended, which was ridiculous considering there wasn't anything else happening on track at that moment in time, which I don't like from the stewards. But here they have said that there was no further action. The stewards heard from the driver of car 16, Charles Leclerc, and George Russell, and the team representatives. Car 63 and 16 were involved in a collision at turn 12, which is the exit, the second part of the chicane, where car 63, George Russell, had been ahead of car 16 into turn 11. Car 63 lost the position to car 16 at the exit of turn 12. That's the key thing here, at the exit of turn 12. So he's ahead into turn 11, and comes out behind him out the exit of turn 12. We investigated with the benefit of driving standards guidelines whether either driver should have done something different. We also looked into whether car 16 remained on the track or left the track at turn 12. That's Charles Leclerc. The available evidence was inconclusive as to whether car 16 left the track. Both team representatives were in agreement that there was no clear evidence that car 16 had left the track. Both drivers felt that this was a racing incident and that there should be no further consequence to either driver for the incident. We reviewed all the available evidence and arrived at the same conclusion. That's a bit of a cop-out. That is a cop-out from the stewards, because we know Toto Wolff said after the race in post-race interviews that we don't want Charles Leclerc to get penalised for what happened at turn 12, because one of our drivers has taken him out, and we don't want Charles to have a grid penalty because he's DNF'd and he wouldn't be able to serve this penalty in the race. Because he didn't even finish the race, so they wouldn't be able to apply a time penalty against him. They didn't want him to have a grid penalty, just like Lewis Hamilton has found himself receiving for Monza. Imagine both Ferrari drivers receiving grid penalties for Monza because neither of them were able to serve their penalties in this race. It's absolutely wild. The stewards should have sorted this out in the race. Now, many will say that the reason they didn't is because they had not sufficient evidence to do so. Well, in the race, Charles Leclerc had that lap time deleted for track limit infringements. They fault. Now, whether or not I still don't think that they use track sensors for this. So, they clearly thought at the time, I don't know how they've done it, but they've clearly concluded within the race itself that Charles Leclerc had exceeded track limits and had been given a track limits violation. So that means he's overtaken off the track. Now, you may be able to say, okay, he hasn't been able to, they might not be able to ascertain whether or not he left the track or not. I think he probably did. It's millimeters if he didn't. I mean, his trajectory through here, I mean, you can see where his left wheel is, and then this one as well is where he's rejoining. But the important thing is that he was never ahead of George Russell. Now, as per the racing rules, again, this is one of those incidents again where Charles, yes, should have been left racing room. I totally agree with that because it was a great send. He was going around the outside, and as you get to the turning point of the corner, he has his front wheels overlapping the rear axle, the rear wheels of George Russell. That, for me, is sufficient to be afforded racing room a car's width. I agree with that. However, as we've just analysed the Carlos Sainz and Liam Lawson incident, that's not how the racing rules are written, which we'll have a look in a second, the racing guidelines. And he never had his front wheels. You can see here, this is George Russell's wing mirror. He never has at any point in the corner his front axle alongside George Russell's wing mirror. Now remember, the car on the outside here, overtaking on the outside of the corner, it will always be viewed as a more difficult move, and therefore it has to have its front axle ahead of the front axle of the other car at the apex. So the overtaking car on the outside has to have its front wheels ahead of the front axle of the other car. So it's not even the wing mirrors. Apologies, I've got that wrong because the inside car has to have their front wheels alongside the mirror. So as it heads into, when you go into the chicane, you can be the outside and then become the inside car, and that's what Charles Leclerc has become. He's become the outside car on the initial turn-in, which he was never had his front wheels in front of George Russell's front axle. So George is entitled to take his racing line and run Charles out of room. And then what Charles has done, he then becomes the inside car, where he's not entitled to any room anyway because George Russell, as we've just touched upon, and then he still doesn't have his front wheels as the inside car alongside George's wing mirrors. So there's, in my opinion, reading that and interpreting it, there's at no point in this move where Charles Leclerc should be afforded racing room. And whether he has made an overtake off the track or not, he rejoined the track and made contact with George Russell, and George Russell technically has caused a collision and he should have received a 10-second time penalty for it. So I even think that while it's dubious that he potentially overtook off the track, he's caused a collision with George Russell, was never afforded racing room as per the racing guidelines, which I'm clarifying here, I do not agree with. And Charles should have been given a 10-second time penalty for that in the race. And instead, he hasn't been given one. So the rules are shit. Let's just be honest. The racing rules are shit. Why should overtaking be so difficult to stewards, and how we shouldn't even be having these conversations right now? The only conversation that we should be having, which a lot of people are having, but they're misinterpreting online because they don't understand the racing rules, are saying he should have been given racing room. He should have been given the room. He wasn't given the room. But he was never entitled to the room at any point in that section of corners, in that overtaking move. It was ballsy for him. We want to see attempted overtakes like that. And people have compared Charles's move here to Oscar Piastri, I think it was the season before, at this very corner, where he was afforded racing room. However, he got alongside Oscar Piastri significantly more heading into turn 11, the initial entry of the corner, and that's why Piastri saw it. He left racing room and Charles didn't even have to drive off track, whereas George was more so ahead into this and arguably caught out by Charles, and then he has used the rules to his advantage. It's Charles to back out of it and Charles hasn't, and that's when then he had that floor damage. So hope that all makes sense. Bit of a rant there as well at the same time, but that's my analysis of it. I hope it does make sense. But ultimately, it shouldn't be like this. It shouldn't be like this, but it's... We want to see these attempted overtakes. We do. But there isn't, as per the racing guidelines, as I've shown you, there was at no point in that overtake, in that sequence, into turn 11 and then into the subsequent inside of turn 12 where Charles was afforded racing room. The only time he gets his front wheels alongside, you can see here, the only time he gets his front axle really alongside those mirrors is when he's actually in the side of George Russell, which is past the apex of the corner. So yeah, if Charles didn't DNF, there's possibility that he'd be getting a penalty. 100%, yeah, they'd apply a they would, yeah, because Mercedes probably would have pursued it as well. They felt a bit sorry because Kimi had taken him out of the race. Toto said that. And he also would have had that penalty applied on his end of his race time or in the next safety car if there would be a safety car, you know. So, yeah, he would have been given a penalty. Would he have been given a penalty in the race? It would have been applied at the end of the race because they already stated way before he had his incident, they stated they were going to review it at the end. The stewards have made their life so difficult, so difficult with how these rules are, and allowing really Max Verstappen to utilise this way of driving for so long that the rules are now this way. And drivers have just... Sometimes they use the rules to their advantage and sometimes they don't. And they get conflicted with wanting fair racing. And the fair racing is being given is being afforded racing room. There does become a point, of course, where you are far enough ahead and that the driver behind, and you have more grip, and the driver behind should yield. There does become a point in that regard. But unfortunately, we are devoid of corners, of side-by-side racing for multiple corners now because of the way the rules are written. So it's unacceptable what the stewards are doing. Yeah, and the problem is that we have no consistency, and it's the reason we have no consistency is because we have different stewards at every bloody race weekend, and it's just like, at least have the same, like maybe 6 stewards that you can rotate in and out of every race weekend, and in that way at least you've got some that maybe step in if someone's ill or whatever, and you've then got a more consistent outlook and interpretation of the rules. Racing is of course always going to be difficult to a certain extent to manage because it's fast, it's flowing, and you have to make decisions very quickly in the moment. But I feel like some of these incidents, they have ample opportunity to make a decision, as